The night air was thick with tension, and the narrow alleyway, lit only by the faint glow of a flickering streetlight, seemed to hold its breath. Jinho, the feared mafia boss of Seoul, stood frozen in the shadows. His heart pounded against his chest, but it wasn't from the usual adrenaline of business deals or street fights. No, this was different. This was the first time in years that he felt vulnerable. In front of him stood Hana, a street dancer. Her wild, unkempt hair fluttered around her face as she moved, a swirl of raw emotion and passion. She wasn't dancing for the money or the crowd, but for herself. Her body seemed to express a freedom Jinho hadn't known since his youth. And yet, there she was, an unlikely threat, her presence breaking through the walls he had spent years building. "You don't belong here." Jinho's voice was cold, his usual authority lacing every word. But even to his own ears, it sounded weak. There was an edge of hesitation in his tone, something unfamiliar. Hana's eyes, dark and defiant, met him without fear. She wasn't intimidated by the man who controlled half the city. She stepped forward, her gaze challenging him with every step. "Maybe I'm the one who doesn't belong," she replied, her voice a soft rebellion, her words cutting through the heavy silence of the alley. Jinho's chest tightened, his muscles reacting to the pull of her gaze. The mafia boss who had once been feared by all now found himself questioning everything he stood for. She wasn't the type of woman he would usually look at twice, and yet, he couldn't look away. Her body moved closer to his, her fingers lightly brushing against his coat, sending a shiver through him. "I know who you are," she whispered, her voice low but filled with something dangerous. Maybe curiosity, maybe something darker. He didn't want to feel it. He didn't want to care. But something in her eyes told him that this moment would change everything. And just when he thought he could regain control, she grasped the edge of his shirt with unexpected force, pulling him down to her level. "You're not the man I thought you were," she said, her breath coming in sharp, trembling bursts. The moment stretched, the tension between them like a charged wire. His body was frozen, not in anger, but in something he couldn't understand. Power. Desire. Vulnerability. Jinho's mind raced, but he couldn't move. His heart hammered in his chest, and for the first time, he felt something he had long buried. The feeling was alien, and he couldn't control it. He was losing himself to her in a way he never thought possible. Jinho's life had never been simple. Born into a family that lived and breathed crime, he had learned early that control was everything. There was no room for weakness, no room for feelings. From the moment he'd stepped into his father's shoes as the leader of the notorious gang, he had made it his mission to keep everything and everyone under his thumb. But Hana was different. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't looking for his approval. She had no idea of his reputation, the blood he'd spilled to keep his position at the top, the people he had crushed beneath his heel. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had captured his attention. And once you had Jinho's attention, there was no going back. The first time he saw her, it was purely by chance. Jinho had been on a routine patrol, the kind that had become second nature to him. But as his car rolled through the streets of Seoul, he saw a crowd gathered around the corner of an alley. Curious, he had walked closer, his mind already on business. But the moment his eyes landed on her, everything changed. Hana was in the middle of a performance, her body moving effortlessly to the rhythm of the music. It wasn't the kind of dancing that begged for attention. It was raw, organic. It was freedom personified. He watched, transfixed by her movements, her grace, her power. There was something magnetic about her, a force that drew him in, a flame he couldn't resist. The crowd around her cheered, but it wasn't their praise that held his attention. It was her. Her every move seemed like it told a story that Jinho couldn't understand. But he wanted to. He wanted to know why she was different from the others. After the performance, she disappeared into the crowd, but Jinho didn't forget. He couldn't. Days passed, but Jinho couldn't shake the image of her. Hana. She was always there, in the back of his mind, a constant pull he couldn't ignore. His men noticed his distraction, but they dared not speak of it. Jinho was the kind of man who didn't let anyone question his focus. But focus was becoming harder and harder to maintain. He couldn't stop thinking about her. One evening, Jinho found himself walking down the same street again, almost by accident. The sounds of the city buzzed in the background, but his mind was elsewhere. And then he saw her again. This time, she wasn't dancing. She was surrounded by a group of men, rough-looking thugs from a rival gang. They were laughing, taunting her. Hana stood tall in the face of their jeers, but Jinho could see it, the fear flickering in her eyes. It ignited something in him. With one swift motion, he was on them. His men quickly followed, but Jinho's rage was more than enough to clear the alley. The thugs scattered like rats, groaning in pain as they stumbled away. Jinho was no longer the cold mafia boss. He was something else now, something fueled by an emotion he couldn't place. As the last thug limped off into the shadows, Jinho turned to face Hana. Her chest was heaving, her face flushed from the confrontation, but her eyes were not filled with fear. They were filled with something else, something Jinho couldn't understand. She stared at him in silence for a long moment, the tension between them palpable. "You didn't have to do that," Hana said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "I could have handled it." Jinho's chest tightened. He didn't know why he had done it. He only knew that in that moment, he couldn't let anyone hurt her. "I couldn't let them hurt you," he replied, his voice almost too low for her to hear. The words were strange to him. They felt foreign. Hana took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You're a mafia boss, right? You control everything." Jinho nodded, his mind racing. He wasn't used to this kind of conversation. But with her it felt different. "I don't want your control," she said, shaking her head. "I want my freedom." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Was that what he had always wanted? Freedom? Or had he traded it for power? Before Jinho could respond, a familiar voice called out from behind him. "Jinho, what the hell are you doing here?" His body stiffened. He knew that voice, one of his trusted lieutenants, Suk, who had been by his side for years. Suk had seen everything, and the last thing Jinho needed was for him to see this. Jinho turned slowly, his heart pounding. He couldn't explain what was happening, not even to himself. "I'm not here for business," he said quickly, trying to hide the truth in his voice. But Suk's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "It looks like you're protecting her." "Why?" Before Jinho could answer, Hana stepped forward, her face filled with determination. "Because he wants to," she said firmly, her voice no longer soft. "Because for once, he's not in control." Jinho's chest tightened as Hana's words settled into his soul. He couldn't lie. "Not now." Not to her. "Get out of here." Jinho growled at Suk, but his voice lacked its usual force. He wasn't angry anymore. He was unsure. Suk hesitated, his eyes flicking between the two of them. "You'll regret this, boss." Jinho didn't care. All he could focus on was Hana, the girl who had made him lose control. And just as Suk turned and disappeared into the night, Jinho turned back to Hana, his heart in his throat. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, the kind of smile that could either heal or break him. And in that moment, Jinho realized the battle for control was just beginning. Jinho stood at the edge of the alley, the cool night air wrapping around him like a shroud. The moment Hana had stepped away, he'd felt a shift within himself, a change he couldn't fully grasp. His thoughts swirled like the winds that whipped through the narrow streets, each one as sharp and cold as the uncertainty settling in his chest. He had never lost control before, not once in his entire life. But with Hana, everything was different. As she turned to leave, a strange impulse surged through him. Before he could think, he called out to her. "Wait." She paused, her back to him. He could see her body tense, as though preparing to walk away, to disappear back into the street like she always did. But this time, Jinho wasn't going to let her go. He stepped closer, his shoes scraping against the cold concrete. "I don't know what you're doing to me, but I can't let you walk away." Her head turned slowly, her eyes locking with his. They were dark, but there was a flicker of something in them, a kind of recognition, or perhaps something even deeper. She didn't speak at first, and in that silence, Jinho could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. "Don't make me feel weak," he finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. The words hung in the air, trembling with raw honesty. For a long moment, Hana said nothing. But then, she did something unexpected. She smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone trying to mock him or belittle him. It was something else, a quiet acknowledgement of something they both shared, something he couldn't name. "You're not weak, Jinho," she said softly. "You just have a lot more to lose than you think." His heart skipped a beat. The way she said his name, the way it left her lips, it made everything inside him tremble. He wasn't sure why, but in that moment, he felt completely exposed, as though she could see right through him. Hana had always been different from the people Jinho knew. She wasn't interested in the luxurious cars, the flashy jewelry, or the power that came with his mafia status. Hana lived in the roughest part of the city, where the streets were a constant battleground. Every day was a fight to survive, not just for money, but for respect. For her, dancing was the only escape, the only way to feel free in a world that tried to put her in a box. She didn't ask for this life, but she made it work. She danced because it gave her a sense of control when everything else was slipping away. And then there was Jinho. His life had been mapped out for him from the moment he was born. Raised by the mafia, trained to take over everything his father had built, he was always in control. He didn't need anyone, didn't want anyone. But the moment his eyes landed on Hana, everything changed. The walls he'd spent his entire life building began to crumble, piece by piece. Jinho had met countless people in his life. Some had feared him, others had respected him, but none had ever made him feel like he needed to prove something to them. None of them had ever questioned him or forced him to see the world in a different way. But Hana? She didn't see him the way everyone else did. She saw through the mafia boss, the ruthless leader, and instead, she saw the broken man behind the facade. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. As he watched her now, standing in front of him in the dim light of the alley, Jinho felt something shift within him. He didn't know how to explain it. It wasn't like anything he had ever felt before. He had always been the one in control, the one everyone turned to for answers. But here he was, standing before a woman who had no idea of the depth of his world, and yet she still had the power to make him question everything. The days that followed were filled with confusion and conflict. Jinho tried to ignore Hana, to push the feelings she stirred in him to the back of his mind. But every time he saw her on the street corner, dancing her heart out, it was as though the world stopped spinning. The music echoed in his head, and no matter how many times he tried to shake the image of her from his mind, it clung to him like a shadow. But he couldn't resist. One evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, Jinho found himself walking towards that same street again. He didn't plan it, not consciously. His feet simply carried him there, as though they knew where they needed to go. And there she was. Hana was performing, as always, but this time, there was a crowd. More than usual. Some were cheering, others filming, but Jinho barely noticed them. All he saw was her. The way her body moved with the music, her expression full of freedom, of life. She looked untouchable in that moment, and Jinho realized he wanted that. He wanted to feel free too. For a moment, he stood on the edge of the crowd, watching her with a mixture of admiration and longing. But then something caught his eye, one of the men from his rival gang. He was leaning against a car, his eyes fixed on Hana. And there was something about the way he looked at her that made Jinho's blood run cold. The man was a troublemaker, a known associate of a rival gang. Jinho knew that if he wasn't careful, this could turn ugly. But as the man stepped forward, his hand reaching out for Hana, something snapped inside Jinho. He moved quickly, shoving past the crowd and toward the man. Hana didn't see what was coming. One moment, she was lost in the music, and the next, the man's hand was on her arm, pulling her roughly toward him. She gasped, the shock of the assault breaking her concentration. Before she could react, Jinho was there, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with a sickening crack. The crowd gasped as the man stumbled back, his eyes wide with surprise. Jinho didn't stop. He grabbed the man by the collar, pulling him close. "Touch her again, and I'll make sure you never walk again," he growled, his voice dark and full of rage. The man didn't say a word. He just looked into Jinho's eyes, understanding the threat perfectly. Slowly, he backed away, stumbling as he retreated. Hana stood there, her body shaking from the adrenaline. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. Jinho, the powerful mafia boss, had stepped in to protect her. But as Jinho turned to face her, his face softening for the first time since they'd met, Hana's breath caught in her throat. He had done it without a second thought. Without hesitation. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jinho stared at her, his emotions tangled, his heart racing. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. What could he say to her? That he had never done anything for anyone without reason before? But now it is different. "I couldn't let him hurt you," Jinho said, his voice raw. Hana's eyes softened. "Why?" Jinho stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Because I don't want to lose you." The words were out before he could stop them, and for a moment, everything froze. Hana blinked, unsure if she had heard him right. She looked at him, searching his face for any hint of insincerity. But there was none. Jinho, the man who had never been afraid to kill, the man who ruled with fear and power, had just confessed something he had never dared to say. And now, as the night settled around them, they were both faced with a choice. The weight of Jinho's words hung in the air like thick smoke, suffocating and impossible to ignore. "I don't want to lose you." Hana blinked in disbelief, her heart racing. This man, this feared mafia boss who ruled with an iron fist, had just exposed something he'd clearly been hiding. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words stuck. What could she say? He had just told her, in no uncertain terms, that he didn't want to lose her, and for the first time in her life, Hana was at a loss. The silence stretched out between them, thick with the unsaid. Jinho stood before her, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. His face was still hardened, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, held something different. Vulnerability? Longing? For a long moment, neither of them moved. The city's distant hum seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them in the alley. "Jinho," Hana finally whispered, but before she could finish, the sound of footsteps cut through the stillness. A shadow loomed from the end of the alley, growing larger as it approached. "Not now," Jinho muttered under his breath, turning abruptly to face the newcomer. His hand brushed the gun at his side instinctively, but he stopped. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice tight with the tension that was rapidly building. A tall man emerged from the shadows, his features unreadable under the dim light. His black jacket was unzipped, revealing the expensive suit underneath. Jinho's pulse quickened, the danger of the situation sinking in as he recognized the figure. "Sook," Jinho said quietly, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" Sook, one of Jinho's most trusted lieutenants, stepped forward slowly, his face a mix of curiosity and concern. "Boss, there's news. You need to hear this. Now." Hana watched as Jinho's posture shifted, the subtle change marking the return of his cold, business-like demeanor. "Whatever it is, it can wait," Jinho said, his voice flat. But Sook didn't back down. "It's urgent, boss. It's about the rival gang. They've made their move." Hana felt a chill crawl up her spine. The mention of the rival gang sent a wave of dread through her. She had heard the rumors, whispers about their brutality, their thirst for power. She knew Jinho was the king of the city, but even kings had enemies. "Give me the news," Jinho said curtly, his eyes flashing with a mix of irritation and authority. Sook stepped closer, his voice low. "They're making moves on our territory, boss. The streets are heating up. They've got someone inside, someone we don't know. They've already started taking control of some of the smaller businesses in our area." Jinho clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "I'll deal with it. Get out of my way." Sook hesitated, but nodded, stepping back toward the alleyway. "I'll be in touch, boss. We can't afford to let this drag out." Jinho didn't answer him. He was already lost in thought, his mind racing with the implications of Suk's words. The rival gang wasn't just making small moves, they were trying to take his empire, piece by piece. And that, to Jinho, was a direct challenge to his authority. When he turned back to Hana, she could see the shift in his expression. His vulnerability was gone, replaced by the cold, ruthless leader he had always been. Jinho turned his back to Hana, his mind already working through the next steps. His body was rigid, his thoughts running a mile a minute. But he had to remind himself, Hana was still there, standing behind him, still processing everything that had happened between them. Hana's eyes followed him, watching as the mafia boss who had just opened up to her now shut himself down again. She knew this man. She had seen him in the darkest corners of the city, seen him intimidate rivals and control every situation. But here, now, she was seeing something else. She was seeing him struggle with something no one else could understand. "You're shutting me out again," Hana said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Jinho froze, his shoulders tensing at the sound of her voice. He hadn't meant to push her away, but that was how it always went. His life, his world, was about power, control, and survival. There was no room for emotions. "You don't understand," he muttered, his back still to her. "This is a world you don't belong in. I'm trying to protect you." Hana stepped forward, her movements deliberate, her feet silent on the cold pavement. "Protect me? By pushing me away? By pretending this doesn't matter?" She was standing inches away from him now, her breath just as fast as his. "You can't just come into my life and expect me to forget about everything else." Jinho turned to face her then, his eyes dark and full of conflict. "I never wanted this," he said quietly, his voice raw. "I didn't ask for this for you." But Hana wasn't backing down. Her eyes held his, her chin raised defiantly. "Neither did I, Jinho. But we're both here now, aren't we?" For a long moment, neither of them moved. The city around them seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the alley. There was a crackling tension between them, the kind that was impossible to ignore. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jinho looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw beyond the street dancer. He saw the woman standing before him, strong, independent, and fearless. But his world was dangerous. It was a world where love didn't survive. And yet, something deep inside him ached for that love. He couldn't let it go. Just as Jinho was about to speak, the distant sound of tires screeching broke the silence. A sleek black car pulled into the alley, its headlights cutting through the dark like a blade. Jinho's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the vehicle. "They're here," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. Hana's body tensed as the car came to a screeching halt in front of them. The door swung open, and a tall, burly figure stepped out. The man's face was familiar, but not someone Jinho trusted. It was Miho, one of the higher-ups in the rival gang. A snake in a suit, always looking for a way to get under Jinho's skin. "Jinho," Miho called, his voice laced with mockery. "I thought I'd find you here all alone." Jinho didn't flinch. His eyes locked with Miho's, but his heart was already racing. He had no idea what Miho was up to, but he knew it was trouble. Miho took a step forward, his smile wide. "I hope you're ready for the real war now, boss. Your empire is about to fall." Hana's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the danger in the air, the tension between Jinho and the man before them. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. Jinho's gaze never left Miho's as he slowly reached for his gun, his fingers tightening around the grip. His expression was cold, unreadable. "Let's see who's really in control," Jinho said, his voice low and dangerous. And just as he took a step forward, the sound of a gunshot echoed through the alley. The deafening sound of the gunshot rang in the alley, its echo bouncing off the cold concrete walls. Time seemed to slow as Jinho instinctively ducked, his heart hammering in his chest. Hana's scream pierced through the chaos as she stumbled backward, her hands instinctively reaching for cover. The gunshot wasn't aimed at Jinho. No, it was aimed at the person closest to him. Hana. Everything went silent, the world suspended in a fragile moment of horror. Jinho's eyes darted to Hana, who had collapsed onto the ground, her body writhing in shock and pain. Her face was pale, her breath shallow as she clutched her chest, her hands trembling. "No," Jinho whispered, his voice barely audible. The word didn't seem to belong to him. It was more like a prayer, an utterance of disbelief. The blood from the wound on her side stained her clothes, turning the once white fabric into a gruesome crimson red. Her chest heaved with each ragged breath, the life slowly draining from her as the seconds ticked by. Jinho's world shattered in that instant. Nothing else mattered. His entire body surged with adrenaline and panic. "No!" he shouted, this time louder, as he fell to his knees beside her. His hands fumbled for the wound, his mind racing as he tried to remember everything he'd ever known about first aid. But there was no time for hesitation. The bullet had already done its damage. "Stay with me, Hana," Jinho pleaded, his voice cracking. His hands hovered over her, not knowing where to touch first, his mind reeling with fear and helplessness. Hana's eyes fluttered open, her pupils dilated with shock. Her lips parted, a faint smile flickering across her face. It was barely a smile, more like a sad acknowledgement of the situation. "I'm not afraid," she whispered, her voice weak but determined. "Jinho, I told you I wasn't afraid of anything, not even this." Jinho's heart clenched, a mixture of guilt and rage surging through him. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to get hurt. But before he could respond, the sound of footsteps approached quickly. He looked up, his eyes cold, narrowing on the figure that had emerged from the shadows. It was Miho, the leader of the rival gang, standing there with a smug grin, a gun still loosely hanging from his hand. Miho's laugh was dark and mocking. "You really thought you could play in my territory, Jinho? You think you can just walk around the city, claiming everything you want without consequences?" Jinho barely heard the words. His focus was entirely on Hana, on the pain in her eyes, and the blood that continued to pour from her wound. She wasn't just a street dancer anymore. She was the one thing he had come to care about, and now, because of him, she was fighting for her life. "Why?" Jinho growled, his voice dripping with anger. "Why her? What did she ever do to you?" Miho took a few slow steps forward, savoring the moment. "It's never about what she did," he said with a twisted grin. "It's about you, Jinho. You were always the one who needed to be taken down. You've made too many enemies." Jinho's eyes flicked to his gun, then back to Miho. His hand tightened around the cold metal. His heart burned with the need for vengeance, for justice. But it was more than just that. He didn't care about power anymore. He didn't care about the rival gang. He cared about Hana. And right now, nothing else mattered. He looked down at her, his eyes softening for the briefest of moments. "Don't close your eyes, Hana. Please don't." Hana's weak smile faltered, and she lifted a trembling hand toward him, brushing her fingers against his cheek. "I'll be okay," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. "I told you, Jinho. I'm not afraid." But Jinho wasn't listening. He could feel the darkness creeping in, the rage boiling inside him, threatening to tear him apart. Without warning, Jinho stood, his body moving like a predator. He was no longer the man who had tried to keep his distance, no longer the mafia boss who played by the rules. He was something else now, something dangerous. Something that had lost control. Miho's grin faltered as he realized the look in Jinho's eyes. But it was too late. Jinho moved with lightning speed, his gun drawn in an instant. The shot rang out, the sound echoing through the alley, but Miho wasn't the target. Jinho's bullet struck the barrel of Miho's gun, sending it flying from his hand. The thug staggered back in surprise, his face suddenly filled with fear. He had underestimated Jinho. He had underestimated the power of a man who had lost everything for the sake of someone else. "You don't get to take her away from me," Jinho said coldly, his voice steely and unwavering. Miho backed up, hands raised in surrender. "I didn't mean." But before he could finish, Jinho grabbed him by the collar, his grip like iron. "Stay the hell out of my way," he hissed, his breath coming fast. "This is between me and her. You're just in the way." Miho's eyes widened, realizing that this wasn't just business anymore. He had pushed Jinho too far. He had crossed a line. The threat in Jinho's eyes made Miho reconsider his next move. Slowly, he nodded.
Fine.
This isn't over, Jinho, he spat, backing away. But you've made an enemy today. As Miho disappeared into the shadows, Jinho didn't let go of the tension in his grip. His chest heaved with anger, but it wasn't just anger, it was fear. He had barely saved Hana. If he hadn't been there. He turned back to her, kneeling beside her once again, his heart pounding. Jinho's hands were shaking as he pressed them to Hana's wound, trying to stop the blood flow, but it wasn't enough. She was losing consciousness. The light in her eyes was dimming, her breath becoming slower, more labored. Please, Jinho whispered, his voice cracking. Stay with me, Hana. You can't leave me. Hana's lips parted, but her words were barely audible. I'm not leaving, she said faintly, her hand reaching out weakly to grasp him. Tears welled in Jinho's eyes, something he had never allowed himself to show before. He had always been the strong one, the one who controlled everything, but now, the reality of what was happening hit him with brutal force. No, 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 he muttered, his hand gripping her arm tighter as he tried to stop the bleeding. His mind raced, trying to think of what to do next. He couldn't take her to the hospital, not with his enemies everywhere. He had no choice. He had to get her out of here. He had to save her. With a quick glance around, Jinho lifted Hana into his arms, his body moving on instinct. He wasn't thinking about the danger, about the world he had created around him. All that mattered was Hana. He was going to protect her, no matter what it took. Jinho carried Hana through the dark alleys. His mind was a blur of panic and adrenaline. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a fear he hadn't experienced in years. The streets, which had once been his domain, now seemed like a maze, a series of obstacles he had to navigate quickly, but carefully. He had to get her to safety. As they neared his car, Jinho heard something, a sound behind him. A car, its headlights cutting through the night, moving fast. He turned, his hand still clutching Hana protectively. It wasn't Miho. It was a different car, and it wasn't slowing down. Jinho's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the figures inside. The enemy had found them. Get in the car. Jinho shouted to his men, who had appeared out of nowhere to help him, but there was no time to waste. The car sped closer, tires screeching, intent on taking Hana from him. Without thinking, Jinho pushed Hana into the back seat, but as he turned to get in, the car's headlights blinded him. Before he could react, the sound of another gunshot rang through the night. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel to support our growth and stay updated on the next part. What do you think will happen next? Comment below.